The what if, that's a question every day. What if I didn't go in there? What if I didn't kill him? What if I never fired a shot? You beat yourself up with these questions. That's pretty much all your life is in here, is self-reflection and thinking about the things that go on, the things that didn't go on, and the things that you wish could go on. My name is Justin Wiley Dickens. I was convicted of capital murder and a robbery homicide, and I received the death penalty. I was born in Amarillo, Texas, July 1976. I was born 2 months premature because my mom was using cocaine. I mean, it was a off and on struggle, but my parents kind of held it together until I was 13, and then they completely split up for good. And then, it was just rocky. I'd run the streets with my mom. She was just a homeless drug addict. We'd just commit petty thefts at stores, and we'd do drugs together and go to jail together and bond out and just keep repeating and repeating and repeating. Dallas Moore was a local tattoo artist, and he was a real charming character, fast talker, slick, got everybody under his wing and as close to him as he could. Being lost as a kid and looking for a father figure, I was just drawn to him, and I was just kind of brainwashed by him. Martha was Dallas Moore's fiance. If they didn't have such a severe drug habit, they would have been really cool friends. I met Dallas and Martha when I was about 15 years old, after me and my friend stole a bunch of weed. I went to Dallas Moore's house to see if he wanted to buy it. They was having a big cocaine party. Everybody shooting the cocaine. I told him I didn't want to try any because my mom was a drug addict and I seen what needles do to people. But he said it was just a mental thing, it wasn't a physical thing. So he eventually got me to snort some cocaine. And about a day or two after that, of around the clock hanging out and drinking, he finally broke me down to try shooting the cocaine. And once I shot the cocaine, we never snorted again. I was just kind of lost. When I was 17, we was partying for about a week straight, and Dallas passed out. He was asleep in the bed, and Martha went into his pocket and took an ounce of cocaine. And she alone used a bunch of it. And before the sun came up, she was in a panic and asked me and my fall partner, Craig Pennell, to drive her around to try to sell some to get the money to pay Dallas before he woke up. When you're a drug addict, all you can think about is drugs. The repercussions of whatever it is are out of sight. You don't think about that. We couldn't sell any of it, and all three of us ended up doing the rest of the cocaine. And on the last stop we made, before we dropped Martha off, we heard Dallas Moore was after us with a pistol. When Dallas caught up with me, it was about 2 in the morning. I was asleep on Craig's couch. I woke up with a knife to my throat. A local drug addict named Eddie Ramos was with him, and they were talking about how they were going to kill me. Craig came in, and then Dallas started beating us up and slapping us around with a pistol. And then he told us to follow him back over to his house. So we went out there, and he pretty much blamed it all on me. He told me that I was to take Martha to the Amarillo Boulevard and pimp her out while she turns tricks to raise the money. But when I agreed to it, he busted my nose and almost knocked me out, saying, "Oh, you would allow Martha to go pimp herself?" And he told me I was going to get his money, and he pointed to a ski mask that he had hanging on the wall. And when he gets in a jam, he handles his business with the ski mask. And he said, "I expect you to do the same thing too. I don't care what you do. You're just going to give me my money." Me and Craig took off in Craig's truck. The only place I knew where to get a gun was my great-grandfather's house, way out in the country. So we drive back into town, and I'm like, pull over here, you know, just trying to find something that we could do. And he's like, "No, I know a place over by my grandparents' house." So we drive across Amarillo. We get to the Mockingbird pawn and jewelry store. Looking back on it now, there's no predicting that was going to happen, but the day felt wrong. The day felt wrong. The reason why I went through with it, because my fear of Dallas overrode my fear of the repercussions of what the law would do. I walked up to the door, and the door had a buzzer lock on it. So they seen me in there, and they buzzed me in. I said I was getting married and I'd like to try on a ring. And they turned their back on me, and when they turned their back on me, I pulled the gun out and cocked it. And I said, "Get down on the ground. I ain't shitting you. I'll kill you." Mr. Jacobs laid where I couldn't see him, and Mr. Carter laid between the two counters with his head facing me. just like 5 feet away. I froze up. I mean, I was totally out of my element. I should have just said, put your hands up and give me some money and let me out. But hindsight's 20/20. And then out of nowhere, Mr. Carter came up with a shoulder tackle and picked me up off my feet. It was just a lightning strike tackle. He never said nothing the whole time. He slammed me into the wall, and I just shrugged up and fired a shot that hit him in the torso. When I slid down the wall with my pistol raised straight in the air like that, and he grabbed the barrel of the gun while he was leaning over me, and he jerked the gun straight up, and the bullet fired through his hand and hit him in the forehead. And I was like, oh no. Mr. Jacobs, he ran out the side door, and I tried to get out the front door. So I shot the last 2 shots into the lock, and I missed it. And I started ramming it with my head and kicking it, and I couldn't get out. So I ran out the back door, and I looked to the left, and Craig was driving away without me. He looked right at me, and we made eye contact, and he just kept on going. I thought, nah, story of my life. So I took off running. I just thought, I can't believe I just killed somebody. That thought was just on a loop over and over and over on my mind. There wasn't no, am I gonna get away with this? Nothing. I was stunned.
For the record, Justin, will you identify yourself? I'm Sergeant Campos. This is Sergeant Montano. What's your name? Full name?
Justin Wiley Dickens.
Okay.
They said, sir, we know what happened. Your fall partner, Craig Pinnell's over here. He's done told us everything. I just hung my head and I started crying and I said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kill nobody. I didn't mean to kill nobody. And I left it at that.
Will you start from the beginning? If it was planned, will you tell us?
It wasn't planned. I didn't know there was a death penalty, but I knew I was in deep trouble.
The robbery and murder at the Mockingbird Street Jewelry occurred March 12, 1994. It was the first major case I tried after becoming district attorney. Justin Wiley Dickens was a volatile individual. I think he suffered from sort of a Napoleonic complex. He realized he wasn't a large fellow, and he compensated for that by strutting and trying to demonstrate that he was a big, bad, dangerous guy. As far as his rationalization, justification for committing the robbery being that he's afraid of Dallas Moore, I think is true of most falsehoods, most lies. You mix in some truth with the lie, and it makes it more believable. I think it was more of a humiliation than any serious beating he took. I think he was beside himself when he was humiliated in front of other people who knew him, because again, his driving desire was to convince everybody that I may not be very big physically, but I'm a dangerous guy. You don't want to mess with me. I believe, and I think the evidence demonstrated, that's exactly what happened in the Mockingbird Street jewelry robbery. Francis Allen Carter tried to approach him and convince him to abandon this robbery attempt. Put down the gun. Don't do this. See, you're going to ruin your life. Let me talk to you. Let's talk about this. You don't want to do this. Dickens responded, as he always did, violently, and shot and killed Francis Allen Carter. Part of Dickens' defense was that Francis Allen Carter provoked his use of the weapon. And that's one of the questions the jury has to answer, whether or not the victim provoked the acts of the defendant. If the answer to that is yes, then by law, the death penalty is not a possibility. There's no way that kind of struggle was occurring while he was being shot. It would be impossible for what he describes to have occurred and not have blood all over him. The forensic evidence is consistent with him being a sufficient distance away from Francis Allen Carter while those rounds are being fired. I don't think Jacob saw a struggle. I think he just made the assumption that that was going to happen. Once he came up off the floor, there was only one thing on his mind, and that was fleeing out the door. I think that's what caused Dickens to panic and start pulling the trigger, not a bull rush from Francis Allen Carter. Justin Wiley Dickens deserved the sentence he received from the jury. He deserved the death penalty because of the kind of person he was and because of what he did, but also because of the victim that he chose to take from all of us. Francis Allen Carter was absolutely one of the most exemplary human beings I have ever heard about, and Dickens robbed all of us of that.
I'm Barbara Lee Blair. I taught with Allen from 1978 until his death in 1994.
And I'm Kim Liel, and I was in Mr. Carter's junior English class. And I've since moved on to teach English in the very same classroom that I took junior English with Mr. Carter.
Allen was a complex, dynamic, interesting, conflicting, confusing man who loved kids.
He looks so young.
He was.
He was.
Well, technically he was 50, but he sure didn't act 50. The kids he helped the most were the kids who would be those who slipped between the cracks. There were no cracks for Allen. The ones who might not make it were going to make it because of Allen Carter.
He recognized the underdog, always.
He simply would not let a child fail. That night when we first heard it, nobody had a clue that there had been a robbery or that he had been shot. We just knew he had died. But the next day at school, details began to come out. And that's when I remember us all the teachers, in the teacher's lounge talking about how would Allen have reacted? What would Alan have done in an armed robbery? What would you do? What would I do? None of us could see Alan confronting somebody with a gun physically. Strong, dynamic, all those things are true, but I can't imagine Alan rushing a gunman. Just not his character, it's not his nature, it's not the way he would behave. But I can imagine him talking with every bit of force and vigor and push that he could to try to get this kid, whoever he was, to see what he was doing. That this is not acceptable, this is not okay. And Alan would have expected that the child would comply, understand, see that, but of course that's not the way it happened.
My name is Russ Bailey. I was the lead attorney for the trial of Justin Wiley Dickens. Justin, to me, seemed to be a fairly decent young man. I'm not going to say he was wonderful based upon what had happened at this point, but, you know, I liked him.
How are you today?
Doing fine, thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much. Anytime you have a capital murder trial, chances are, in all likelihood, they're going to ask for the death penalty. That's the only reason to file for a capital murder charge. So the first thing we did is we pled him guilty to involuntary manslaughter, which is a lesser-included offense and part of the charges against Justin. Now, the issue here is whether or not Justin really intended to kill Mr. Carter because he felt like it or because he wanted to. I mean, Mr. Farron read the same reports I did. And realistically, the only way this could have taken place is this way. When Justin pulled the gun, there was a counter between Justin and the two individuals that were in that store at that point in time. He did tell both parties to get down. And at that point, he realized he was making a very foolish mistake. And I think as a result of him turning his back on Mr. Carter came across that counter. And in the course of events, was shot when they were fighting for that gun. There was an eyewitness, Mr. Jacobs, but he wouldn't sign his statement unless he got approval from Mr. Farron. I'm not too sure why he needed Mr. Farron's approval, because I know if I gave a statement to somebody, I would live with that statement because it's true.
The forensic evidence is consistent with him being a sufficient distance away from Francis Allen Carter while those rounds are being fired.
I just can't fathom they actually accepted that. I would have assumed that the police department would have at least what they call strung the room to determine where the bullets went and where they came from. This would have proven or shown possibly about the fight between Justin Dickens and Mr. Carter. But they never strung it. They didn't think it was relevant to anything. It could have made a big difference for us. But then again, the police department doesn't work for the defense, they work for the state of Texas. Justin, to me, seemed to be a very young man that was just scared to death. What we were able to ascertain is that Dallas Moore had threatened him to get him some money back for something that he, Justin, and Mr. Moore's wife had supposedly done. If Dallas Moore had taken the stand, then it may have come out that there were a lot more things going on than the state was willing to acknowledge to that jury. And if we could have got his wife there separately from Dallas, his wife could have testified as to what actually happened between him and Justin. But It was amazing. All of a sudden, Mr. Moore and a lot of the other witnesses we wanted were gone. Now, I don't know what happened, how it got there to that point, but our investigator could not find them anywhere. And I'm not saying the state did anything wrong. It's just the fact Dallas was covering his own backside, so to speak. And so, yeah, I can understand him taking it off based on that, but it sure would have helped us.
I met Justin 2 years before the incident in 7th grade. We were in a summer school class together at Sam Houston Summer School. Just gonna feed him. Face, you wanna eat, babe? No leftovers in this house. Justin, he was a little wild country boy talking about hog hunting and, you know, bow and arrows. He was pretty wild for a kid. Okay, guys, come on. Sarah, be nice. My father knew his mother from drugs. Be nice. So I ended up running into Justin at my dad's house. At that moment, I think I realized that my friends were, you know, doing a little bit more than smoking a little bit of weed and having a couple of shots here and there to party. My father, he's really charismatic. I mean, people are drawn to him. I would say that he's comparable to a much more friendly Charles Manson. He just can draw the people in. He has a way of making people do what he wants them to do. He was in and out of prison my whole life. Each time he got out of prison, instead of getting better, he got worse. It just seemed like the further it went, it was like a downward spiral, you know, more and more charges until it led to this point, you know, 25 years later. The last 8 months, he's been a fugitive for actually tying up an 83-year-old woman and hurting her in her home, a home invasion. Something that you wouldn't think that your father would do, but
well, my dad wanted Fort Worth. My mom wouldn't let him name me Fort Worth, so I ended up with Dallas. And my name came up like 58 times in this trial, so everybody's wanting to talk to me. I'm like the star of the show. I don't lie. Most people tell you I don't lie. I shoot straight from the hip. My daughter introduced me to Justin. Did she tell you that? Man, that little shit. He caused so much trauma in my life. My wife liked him. They stole over fucking an ounce from me. Did he tell you that? I was asleep. Took it all from me. I put my gun to the kid's head and I said, I'm going to Martha's and you guys are going to apologize for letting her leave my house, you know, and robbing me. You guys are supposed to be my friends.
He pretty much blamed it all on me. He pointed to a ski mask that he had hanging on the wall, and he said, I don't care what you do, you're just going to give me my money.
Ooh, I put that on the Bible. I swear to God. Man, that is a fictitious lie. That's a fictitious lie. I never said, boom, 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 you're gonna go do this and do that, go get my mother and send him on a robbery. That is BS. I did not want no involvement in his bullshit and had no idea that he would fucking goddamn do that. I let him off. He didn't really rob me. My wife robbed me. So I said, I want you to take my wife to the motel and watch her. Make sure no trick stays with her more than 15 minutes and let her earn my fucking money. She's the one who took my shit. Will you do that for me? He goes, yeah, I'll pimp that bitch. When he said that, I hit him. You look at his mugshots. When he got to, I wouldn't let him get up. I kick-stomped his ass straight out my house, and I told him, don't you ever come back to my house. You can't pay me. You can't buy nothing. You can't do nothing. You can't apologize. I don't want your piece of shit ass at my house ever again. That's what I told him. I'm not going to be made out some Charles Manson. You know what I mean? I don't want to be no involvement of that man getting murdered because I didn't have no involvement in it. He didn't owe me nothing. His debt was paid in full when I punched him out. I think he should get a break, but not a break at my expense to sit there and say, I told him and ordered him to go do that, dude. I would tell you if I had said that, but no. No. If he went to rob that, he went to rob that to try to fucking impress my wife.
Well, my name is Martha Cummins Bell now. I got clean from all drugs in '97. I am a mom. I have 7 kids. 4 sandwiches and 2 salads.
Okay. Thank you.
I work at an agency that specializes in treating people with borderline personality disorder. Almost always suicidal or self-harming. So I can relate to that. I cut ties with Dallas a long time ago. So I'm not afraid of him anymore. He's just nervous.
Oh, God.
I remember when I met Justin.
Okay. We'll be there. I met Bates.
I lived in an apartment with Dallas.
This is cute. That one's
Who's Justin?
Mom.
First of all, I thought he was about 12.
There he is, right there, Martha.
And he was like a little street kid. The little short one is Justin.
With the blue shirt on.
There was a real innocence about Justin.
Oh, there's Dallas.
Dallas was 10 years older than me, and I met him after he had done, I think, close to 10 years in a Missouri State Penitentiary. I think we were all kind of sucked into that excitement and the drug use. And Dallas was older than all of us and had already been to prison and was just so cool.
I've been with the putting a gun in Dad's mouth.
Do you remember
Is it
him?
a real gun?
Yes, that's a real gun.
Does it have bullets in it?
I'm sure it doesn't.
There were reasons to be afraid of Dallas.
Dallas passed out, and Martha went into his pocket and took an ounce of cocaine.
I think I had some resentments about him having the cocaine in his pocket, and I wanted it in my pocket. So one night I gave him a lot of Valium and put him to sleep and took the cocaine out of his pocket. Craig and Justin and I started doing the cocaine, and we got to a point in the bag where there was no return. And I knew that we were all fucked, basically. I know that Dallas expected to be reimbursed, and that we were all pretty terrified. I don't know why it all became Justin's responsibility. There was a ski mask nailed onto the wall in our trailer, and Dallas pointed at the ski mask and said, "That's how I handle my debts." I think that Justin did what he thought he had to do, and I don't think that he meant to ever hurt anybody. I think he just meant to pay Dallas back. And I know a man lost his life, right? I mean, that's the other side of this, is that somebody died. But it also took Justin's life. Justin pulled the trigger. Craig drove the car. I stole the dope. And if I had been a guy and I hadn't have been married to Dallas, I probably would have been in the car too. I just don't know how someone can get put on death row for something like this.
Dickens' defense was that Francis Allen Carter provoked his use of the weapon. And if the answer to that is yes, then by law, the death penalty is not a possibility.
There was an eyewitness to Mr. Jacobs, but he wouldn't sign his statement unless he got approval from Mr. Farron. Alan, of course, was a teacher, and as a side venture, he would buy and sell jewelry. Yeah, he was a good personal friend. Alan and I were visiting together, and a customer came to the front door. It was electronically protected as far as in and out is concerned. So we buzzed him in, let him visit around. And when we were off doing our business, he just pulled a gun, pointed at us and said, "Okay, this is a robbery. Get down on the floor." And so that's what we did. We laid down on the floor, and he said, "Spread out," for whatever reason. At some point, and I still don't know why, Alan decided it was time for him to take action. And he came up off the floor, crossed the jewelry counter, and engaged the kid. And was trying to take the gun from him when it went off. That was the first shot. Then the second one was when he was trying to push the gun away, I think, and it came up through the webbing in his finger and hit him in the head as well. The one that caught Alan the second time is the one that I'm sure killed him. And that's when I went out the back door.
I don't think Jacob saw a struggle. I think he just made the assumption that that was going to happen. the forensic evidence is consistent with Dickens being a sufficient distance away from Francis Allen Carter while those rounds are being fired.
Farron, he's good at his job. No problem about that part of it at all, but I don't understand him trying to put words into the circumstances that I was seeing. I told him that Alan was trying to get the gun when the shots went off. So how can you do that from afar off if you aren't close enough to grab the gun?
Grief never goes away. It changes. You feel sadness, you feel anger, confusion, frustration. You feel all alone in the world, but it never goes away. The heart aches for that person all the time. My name is Christy Carter, and I am the very proud daughter of Alan Carter. Daddy always came to Amarillo on Saturdays to do his jewelry business. And this particular Saturday, I just had a bad feeling and I didn't want him to come to Amarillo. And at 4:30 that afternoon, he called me. I can still hear his voice. It was, I love you, baby girl. I'll call you when I get home. And that was it. I was watching the 5 o'clock news when they had breaking news that there had been a shooting at Mockingbird Pawn and Jewelry. And I knew immediately that something had happened to Daddy. So, just went to the hospital and he was still alive. And he had just passed away when Mama got to Amarillo. But I had to tell her. The only reason that Daddy would go for the gun is because he felt that no amount of talking could persuade Dickens to not do this or put down the gun. But that was also Daddy. Daddy got the Soldier's Medal in Vietnam for saving 3 other soldiers' lives. That's right under the Navy Cross. That's what Daddy did. He tried to find a solution. He didn't know any different. He didn't do any different. And so, to me, if he went for the gun, that's exactly what he was doing. It was a young man struggling, and he was going to help him. If I went to see Dickens, I think that he really wouldn't care that I was there. But I just need him to see that life did go on for us. And yes, it's been hard. And yes, it's been painful. To be 20 years old and lose your father, and to see Mama alone, missing him and me missing him, but he didn't take it all away. And I need him to know that I have forgiven him for what he did. That doesn't mean I like him. That doesn't mean I want to be his pen pal. But for me to go on, I had to forgive him. But I don't think he would care. The one thing that will always stick out in my mind about Dickens is the very last question of the trial. And James asked him, now that you have met Mr. Carter's wife and daughter and mother and brothers and sisters, how do you feel about what you did? And Dickens looked at us and then looked at James Farron and said, you know, Mr. Farron, I'm really, really sorry this happened to me.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I said that. I'm sorry. I was a jackass. I mean, what I said was probably devastatingly cruel, but I can't even make an excuse for that.
June 18th, Sill, 1976, began like an ordinary summer morning in the Sacramento area, but before that day was over, a crime would begin a chain of events that would stretch across for decades, terrify communities throughout California, generate one of the largest manhunts in the state's history, and eventually become one of the most extraordinary cold case investigations ever solved through DNA. The man responsible had no name the public could recognize, no photograph that could reliably identify him, no arrest record that exposed his identity. For years, he would exist only as a collection of descriptions, memories, crime scene, evidence, and terrifying aliases. But on that first known morning, investigators did not yet know they were looking at the beginning of something enormous. They only knew that a woman in the Rancho Cordova Carmichael area had been attacked inside her home. The FBI later identified June 18th, Sill, 1976, as the starting point of the case. What followed would make the name East Area Rapist synonymous with fear in Sacramento, and later connect that offender to murders in Southern California under another name. Eventually, investigators would determine that the same man had committed crimes across the state, becoming known as the original Night Stalker, and, later, the Golden State Killer. But in 1976, there was no reason for anyone to imagine such a future. There was only a crime, a victim, and an unknown intruder who had managed to enter a private residence without being detected. The details investigators later gathered revealed a disturbing pattern. The offender often approached residences from the rear, forcing open doors or windows. He concealed his identity, frequently using a ski mask, and used a flashlight to disorient victims. The FBI later reported that burglaries often preceded clusters of sexual assaults in the Sacramento area. Small objects such as coins, jewelry, and identification could be taken during burglary. Homes belonging to families, couples, and single women could become targets. The randomness created another layer of terror because ordinary routines offered no guarantee of safety. A locked door was no longer enough. A quiet neighborhood was no longer necessarily safe. A person sleeping in their own bedroom could suddenly find that the boundaries between private life and criminal violence had disappeared. And then the reports began to accumulate. One case became another. Another became another. Detectives began to recognize similarities. The offender was not simply committing isolated burglaries or assault. He appeared to be studying neighborhoods, watching routines, testing security, and returning where he believed he could operate. The fear spread faster than investigators could stop it. Sacramento residents began changing their behavior. According to the FBI, people purchased dogs, changed locks, and in some cases slept with shotguns because they feared the offender might enter their homes. That reaction reveals something the statistics alone cannot capture. 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and more than 120 residential burglaries are staggering numbers. But numbers do not explain what it feels like when an entire community begins to suspect that a predator may be watching. The fear becomes part of everyday life. A sound outside after dark becomes suspicious. A window becomes a vulnerability. A door becomes a question. Every unfamiliar vehicle can seem important. Every shadow can feel like a warning. and the police were under enormous pressure to identify the man responsible. The investigation was complicated by the sheer number of incidents and the geographic movement of the offender. The FBI later described his activity as beginning in the greater Sacramento area from 1976 into early 1978. His crimes then expanded into the East Bay area and later into communities along the California coast. Each new attack added another piece to a puzzle that investigators were still learning how to assemble. The offender was not presenting investigators with a simple, stationary pattern. He was moving. He was adapting, and he was leaving behind survivors whose descriptions could help build a picture of the man they had encountered. Yet even a collection of descriptions could not immediately give detectives a name. Witnesses could remember his approximate height, build, hair, clothing, voice, or movements, but those details had to be translated into something investigators could use. Sketches were produced, information was circulated, neighborhoods were searched, leads were pursued, but the offender remained ahead of the investigation. The most disturbing possibility began to emerge. This was not a single incident. It was a continuing series. The crimes were connected by patterns in behavior and, eventually, by biological evidence. But at the beginning, detectives had to work without the forensic technology that would later define the case. DNA profiling was not yet the investigative tool it would become. The FBI notes that its laboratory did not perform DNA analysis for criminal investigations until 1988, more than a decade after the first known Golden State Killer attack. That technological gap would become one of the defining facts of the investigation. Evidence could be collected and preserved, but investigators could not yet extract from it the kind of genetic identity that modern detectives would eventually take for granted. The offender, therefore, benefited from the limitations of his era. The police could collect evidence, but science could not yet turn that evidence into a name. And as the years passed, the crimes became more terrifying. In February 1978, the violence escalated again. Brian Maggiore, a Rancho Cordova police officer, and his wife Katie were out walking their dog when they were confronted by the offender. Both were killed. The FBI later identified the Maggiore murders as connected to the East Area rapist investigation. The significance of the killings was enormous. The case was no longer only about residential burglaries and sexual assault. An offender who had already demonstrated an ability to invade homes had now been linked to homicide. The fear in Sacramento intensified. Investigators were no longer simply trying to stop a serial rapist. They were searching for a killer. And still, his identity remained hidden. The public knew the crimes. Investigators knew the pattern, but nobody knew the man. That absence would become the central mystery of the case. As 1978 progressed, the offender's activity shifted. The investigation expanded beyond Sacramento, moving into other parts of Northern California. By 1979, his crimes were being associated with communities in the East Bay. Then the geography changed again. Southern California became the scene of a new series of attacks and killings. The same offender who had terrified Sacramento would eventually be connected to murders in Goleta, Ventura, Laguna Niguel, and Irvine. Investigators in different jurisdictions were now dealing with crimes that appeared frighteningly similar, but geography created barriers. Different departments had different files. Different detectives had different theories. Different communities knew the offender by different descriptions. The investigation was becoming fragmented even as the criminal pattern was becoming larger. Eventually, the man responsible would acquire another name, the original Night Stalker. That name reflected the California communities where the murders occurred and the nighttime nature of the attacks. Years later, investigators would recognize that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same offender. But during the early years, the connection was not yet fully understood. This was the beginning of a mystery within a mystery. There was an unknown rapist in Northern California. There was an unknown killer in Southern California. And somewhere in the evidence was the biological connection that would eventually prove they were one man. But that revelation was still decades away. In the meantime, the investigation continued through old-fashioned detective work. Officers interviewed survivors, detectives compared crime scenes, investigators studied patterns, information was shared when possible, sketches were circulated, communities were warned. But every time the offender disappeared, the same question returned. Who was he? The FBI's later description of the offender showed how elusive he had been. Investigators believed he might have had an interest in or training in military or law enforcement techniques and was proficient with firearms. Yet the Bureau also warned that people who knew him might not believe him capable of such crimes and that he might not have displayed obvious violent tendencies or a criminal history. That detail would become especially chilling after the eventual identification. The man investigators were searching for did not necessarily fit the image the public expected. He did not have to look like a monster. He could appear ordinary. He could exist in a neighborhood without attracting suspicion. He could work, interact with others, and move through daily life while carrying a secret that would remain hidden for decades. That was the terrifying possibility at the heart of the case. The killer did not need to disappear completely. He only needed to remain unidentified. And for years, he succeeded. The investigation grew colder as the years accumulated, but the evidence did not vanish. Crime scenes had been documented. Biological material had been preserved. Memories remained. The case files became thicker. Detectives changed. Technology advanced. The world moved forward. Yet somewhere inside those old files was a clue capable of destroying the offender's anonymity. It would take decades before investigators discovered exactly how powerful that clue could become. At the time, however, all they could see was a terrifying, unknown man moving through California, leaving behind frightened survivors, grieving families, and communities desperate for an answer. The case had begun with one attack in 1976. It would eventually stretch across California, across generations, and across an entire revolution in forensic science. And the most disturbing part was that the man they were hunting had not vanished. He was still somewhere in the world, living beyond the reach of investigators, while the evidence that could eventually expose him waited silently for the future. The investigation was no longer dealing with a single frightening incident. By the late 1970s, detectives were confronting a pattern, and patterns are what turn isolated crimes into something much more dangerous because a pattern suggests intention, repetition, and a person who is learning from every encounter. In Sacramento County, the offender had demonstrated that he could approach homes without immediately being detected, enter residences, control victims, and disappear before police could arrive. He appeared to understand the neighborhoods where he operated. He knew that darkness created opportunities. He knew that fear could silence people. And most disturbing of all, he seemed to understand how much uncertainty could work in his favor. Investigators were gathering reports from different neighborhoods and attempting to determine whether the same offender was responsible. The FBI later described a sequence of crimes that began in the greater Sacramento area in 1976 and continued into early 1978 before expanding geographically. But the investigation was taking place in an era before computerized databases could instantly connect thousands of records. There was no modern genetic genealogy. There was no national forensic DNA database capable of instantly comparing biological evidence. Even the concept of using DNA to identify an unknown criminal was years away from becoming practical. Detectives therefore had to rely heavily on interviews, physical evidence, sketches, surveillance, and cooperation between agencies. Every new attack created urgency, but it also created another layer of complexity. The offender's behavior was becoming more recognizable, yet his identity remained hidden. The Sacramento communities affected by the attacks began to change. People talked about the crimes constantly. Neighborhoods that had once felt safe became places where residents watched windows and doors with new suspicion. The FBI later recalled that people bought dogs, replaced locks, and in some cases slept with firearms because they feared the offender might return. The fear was not limited to the homes where crimes had already occurred. It spread outward. Anyone living in the area could imagine that their house might become the next target. A neighborhood could look peaceful in daylight and completely different after sunset. The offender's nighttime activity created a psychological landscape in which ordinary sounds became potential warnings. A branch striking a window, footsteps outside, a vehicle stopping on the street, a door that seemed slightly out of place. The danger was not visible, but the possibility of danger was everywhere. Detectives faced another problem. The offender was not simply committing crimes in one predictable location. The FBI later described his activity as moving from Sacramento into the East Bay area and eventually into coastal California. Each geographical shift complicated the investigation. Different law enforcement agencies possessed pieces of the story. One department might know about a burglary pattern. Another might be investigating a sexual assault. Another might be examining a homicide. To understand the entire picture, investigators needed to recognize that the crimes belonged together. That recognition did not happen instantly. It developed over time through comparison of evidence and behavior. The offender himself helped create the illusion of separate cases by operating across different areas. But the underlying pattern remained. He was entering homes. He was targeting people at night. He was controlling victims and eventually the violence escalated to murder. The killings of Brian and Katie Maggiore in February 1978 represented one of the most disturbing developments in the Sacramento investigation. Brian Maggiore was a Rancho Cordova police officer, and he and his wife were walking their dog when they were attacked. Both were killed. The FBI later identified their deaths as connected to the East Area rapist investigation. Suddenly, investigators were confronted with an offender whose threat extended beyond sexual violence. He had demonstrated that he was willing to kill. The psychological effect on the community was immediate and profound. If a police officer could be killed while simply walking with his wife, what did that mean for everyone else? The answer was frightening. No one could assume that ordinary routines provided protection. The investigation became more urgent, but urgency did not automatically produce an identification. Detectives needed evidence that could survive scrutiny. They needed witnesses who could describe the offender. They needed physical evidence that could separate crime. They needed a way to determine whether the same person was responsible for incidents occurring miles apart and weeks or months apart. That was where forensic science began to matter in a new way. Even before DNA profiling became available, investigators collected biological evidence from crime scenes. At the time, its potential was limited, but evidence does not need to be immediately useful to become important later. This principle would eventually define the entire case. Investigators could not know that the biological material preserved from the crimes would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in American criminal history. They simply knew that it might matter. Meanwhile, the offender continued to move. By the late 1970s, investigators were dealing with a growing number of victims and an offender who seemed capable of adapting to changing circumstances. The FBI later reported that the crimes included residential burglaries, sexual assaults, and eventually homicides. The criminal pattern was expanding, but the identity remained hidden. Investigators produced descriptions and sketches. Survivors provided details about the man's physical appearance, behavior, and voice. These descriptions were invaluable, but they also had limitations. A person seen during a terrifying assault does not experience the event like a detective studying a photograph. Fear changes perception. Darkness limits visibility. Stress affects memory. An offender wearing a mask makes identification even more difficult. Investigators therefore had to build a suspect profile from fragments. No single witness could provide the entire answer. Instead, detectives collected pieces and searched for overlap. The challenge was enormous. The suspect could be described in general terms, but thousands of men could potentially fit those descriptions. The investigation needed something more specific. The answer would eventually come from biology, but biology itself had not yet reached the necessary stage. The FBI notes that DNA analysis for criminal investigations at its laboratory began in 1988. That date is crucial because it shows how far investigators were from the technology that would eventually solve the case. When the first known attacks occurred in 1976, modern forensic DNA identification simply was not available. The evidence could be preserved, but the scientific tools required to convert that evidence into a precise genetic profile did not yet exist. This meant that the offender had a technological advantage created by history itself. He committed crimes before DNA profiling became a routine forensic tool. Every year he remained unidentified increased the distance between the original investigation and the technology that would eventually expose him. Yet that same passage of time would eventually work against him. As the investigation continued, the offender's identity became one of the most persistent questions in California law enforcement. Was he a local resident? Did he have knowledge of police procedures? Did he have military experience? Did he live close to the areas he targeted? Did he maintain a normal life when he was not committing crime? The FBI later stated that investigators believed the offender might have had an interest in or training in military or law enforcement techniques and was proficient with firearms. But they also warned that acquaintances might not have believed him capable of the crimes and that he might not have shown obvious signs of violent behavior. That possibility made the investigation even more difficult. Detectives could search for someone who looked suspicious, but the offender did not necessarily advertise his criminal behavior. He could blend into ordinary society. He could have neighbors who considered him normal. He could have colleagues who knew nothing about his hidden life. The killer did not need to become a fugitive. He needed only to remain outside the investigator's line of sight. As months became years, the public began to understand that this was not a crime spree that would end quickly. It was becoming a long-term threat. Every new attack reinforced the fear that the offender was still active. Every quiet period created uncertainty rather than relief. Was he gone? Had he stopped? Was he preparing to strike somewhere else? The lack of answers was itself terrifying. Investigators had to work with what they had, and what they had was a collection of crimes that appeared connected by a single unknown offender. The man was still unidentified. His face remained uncertain. His name remained unknown. His location remained unclear. And the biological evidence that would eventually reveal his identity was still sitting silently in evidence files, waiting for a scientific revolution that had not yet arrived. Then the geography began changing again. The crimes moved beyond the Sacramento region, and the investigation entered a new and even more complicated phase. The offender was no longer simply an East Area problem. His trail was beginning to stretch across California. That expansion would eventually lead investigators toward a second series of murders in Southern California, where another name would emerge for the same unknown man. But at this stage, investigators did not yet have the full picture. They were still looking at fragments. Northern California had its predator. Southern California would soon have its own nightmare. Years would pass before anyone realized they were searching for the same person. And somewhere between those two investigations was the hidden connection that would ultimately change everything. A biological signature left behind by the offender himself. The evidence was already there. The identity was not. The mystery had only just begun. The crimes were spreading, but the most frightening development was not simply that the offender continued to attack. It was that he appeared to understand how to turn ordinary homes into controlled crime scenes, using darkness, surprise, and careful preparation to dominate people before they could react. By 1978, investigators were beginning to see a disturbing consistency in the way the unknown man operated. He did not simply stumble into houses. He appeared to select neighborhoods, watch them, and sometimes burglarize homes before sexual assaults occur. The FBI later reported that burglaries in the Sacramento area often preceded clusters of attacks, and that the offender commonly entered through rear doors or windows, concealed his face with a ski mask, and used a flashlight to disorient victims. That pattern suggested planning. It suggested patience, and it suggested that the man investigators were chasing could spend days, sometimes weeks, studying a neighborhood before making his move. That realization changed the atmosphere around the investigation. The question was no longer simply whether another attack would happen. It was where it would happen and whether investigators could get there before the offender did. Sacramento residents responded with fear. People changed locks. Dogs became more common. Some residents slept with firearms. The FBI later recalled the atmosphere as one in which people were terrified because they understood that the offender had repeatedly demonstrated that ordinary security measures might not be enough. But fear did not stop him. And then came the case that forced investigators to confront an even darker possibility. On February 2nd, still 1978, Brian Maggiore, a Rancho Cordova police officer, and his wife Katie were walking their dog when they were confronted by the offender. Both were killed. The FBI later linked the double homicide to the East Area Rapist investigation. For detectives, the murders changed the case forever. A predator who had already terrorized Sacramento had now been associated with homicide. The distinction mattered. Sexual assaults were already devastating, but murder introduced a finality that transformed the threat. The offender had demonstrated that he could kill. And if he could kill once, investigators had to assume he could do it again. The Maggiore murders also created a strange investigative problem. The victims had not simply been attacked inside their home. They were outside, walking their dog. That meant the offender's behavior was not limited to one specific type of residential intrusion. His willingness to confront people away from the bedroom made the danger seem even less predictable. Detectives were now trying to understand an offender whose behavior could shift as circumstances changed. The case became increasingly urgent, but urgency alone could not provide the one thing investigators needed most: a name. They had descriptions. They had patterns. They had evidence. They had frightened communities. But the offender remained anonymous. The FBI would later describe the East Area Rapist as a white male, approximately 6 feet tall, with blonde or light brown hair and an athletic build. Investigators also believed he might have had military or law enforcement interests or training, and was proficient with firearms. Yet authorities warned that people who knew him might never have suspected him of such crime. He might not have displayed obvious violent tendencies or possessed a criminal history. That possibility was deeply unsettling. It meant the offender might not resemble the image of a dangerous fugitive. He could have a job. He could have neighbors. He could have acquaintances who regarded him as completely ordinary. The killer did not need to disappear from society. He only needed to disappear from the investigation. And as the months passed, the geography of the crimes began to change. After the Sacramento period, the offender continued primarily in Northern California's East Bay area. Then, by October 1979, investigators began seeing a new and horrifying phase along the California coast. The FBI later identified murders in Goleta, Ventura, Laguna Niguel, and Irvine between 1979 and 1981, with another associated homicide occurring in Irvine in 1986. The Sacramento investigators had been hunting the East Area Rapist. Southern California investigators were now confronting what appeared to be another predator. The names were different, the locations were different, the investigations were different, but the underlying offender was the same. The connection would take years to establish. In the coastal attacks, the violence became even more lethal. Investigators later determined that the offender attacked couples, tied them up, sexually assaulted the female victim, and then killed the victim. The pattern was horrifying because the offender was no longer simply invading homes to commit sexual assaults. Murder had become part of the pattern. The person investigators had been searching for in Northern California was evolving into something far more dangerous, and yet there was still no name. The public could only know the killer through descriptions and the frightening aliases that emerged from different investigations. The phrase "original Night Stalker" eventually became associated with the Southern California murders. The earlier Northern California offender was still known as the East Area Rapist. 2 names, 2 regions, 1 man, but nobody knew that yet. That fragmentation would become one of the greatest obstacles in the investigation. Separate agencies possessed separate pieces of evidence. Detectives were trying to solve crimes within their own jurisdictions. The connections between them were difficult to see. A crime in Sacramento could seem impossibly distant from a murder in Southern California, but the offender himself carried the connection with him. He left biological evidence. He left behavioral patterns. He left details that would eventually allow investigators to reconstruct his path across the state. The most important of those clues would not be understood immediately. DNA technology was beginning to emerge, but it was still primitive compared with the tools that would later identify D'Angelo. The FBI's own laboratory did not begin performing DNA analysis for criminal investigations until 1988. That means that when the offender committed the earliest known crimes in 1976, investigators were operating in a world where biological evidence could not yet provide the kind of genetic identification that would later become routine. The evidence could be collected. It could be stored. It could be examined using the forensic methods of the time, but the revolutionary capability was still years away. The offender benefited from that technological gap without ever needing to understand it. He did not need to know that science was about to change. He only needed to remain unidentified long enough for the investigation to lose momentum. And the investigation was already under extraordinary pressure. Every new crime generated new reports. Every survivor added another memory. Every scene produced more evidence. Detectives had to compare details and determine whether apparently unrelated incidents belonged to the same offender. The process was slow, exhausting, and vulnerable to the limitations of human memory and communication. Yet investigators continued. They built files. They collected descriptions. They preserved biological material. They compared crime scenes. They searched for connections. The FBI later emphasized that DNA evidence from multiple crime scenes could be used to link or eliminate suspects, even before the offender's identity was known. That distinction would eventually become crucial. The DNA could not initially say who the offender was, but it could say who he was not. An innocent suspect could potentially be eliminated. A person who seemed to fit the description could be ruled out if the biological evidence did not match. In a case with so many possible suspects, that ability was enormously valuable. But there was a problem. Investigators still needed candidates to test. The DNA could provide a definitive comparison, but it could not simply produce a name from nowhere. For decades, that limitation kept the case trapped between evidence and identity. The biological clue existed, but the bridge to a person did not. The investigation therefore moved through another phase of uncertainty. In Northern California, the East Area rapist had become a notorious figure. In Southern California, a killer was leaving behind murdered couples. Investigators were beginning to suspect connections, but the proof would not arrive until much later. Then, in 2001, a critical forensic development finally connected the two investigations. DNA linked the East Area rapist to 6 Southern California murders committed between 1980 and 1986. Suddenly, the separate names began collapsing into one biological identity. The rapist from Sacramento and the killer from Southern California were the same person. The revelation was staggering. It meant the offender's criminal history was far larger than either investigation had previously represented on its own. It also meant that the same unknown man had managed to move across California while remaining unidentified for decades. The case had now become a statewide mystery. But even with the DNA connection, investigators still faced the same fundamental question. Who was he? They knew the biological profile. They knew the crimes were connected. They knew the offender had operated over a 10-year period. They knew he had committed multiple murders and dozens of sexual assaults. Yet the name remained hidden. The DNA could connect the crimes, but it could not identify the person. That was the cruel paradox of the investigation. The evidence was becoming stronger while the suspect remained invisible. And then the years began to accumulate. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. 20 became 30. The offender grew older. Investigators retired. Survivors aged. Some witnesses died. Some memories became harder to access. The case became a cold case in the public mind, but not in the minds of those still working it. The FBI later stated that investigators had never completely given up. The DNA profile remained available. It could exclude suspects. It could connect crimes. It could preserve the biological identity of the offender even when his name was unknown. And that meant the case was never truly empty. Somewhere in the evidence was a signature that belonged to the killer. The problem was that the world had not yet developed the right way to read it. Then science began moving toward that answer. DNA profiling became more sophisticated. Databases expanded. Investigative genealogy emerged, and suddenly, a case that had survived for decades began to look different. The Golden State Killer was still unidentified, but the nature of the evidence had changed. What once seemed like a dead end could become a starting point. What once connected crimes could eventually connect a family. And what once produced only an anonymous DNA profile could, under the right circumstances, lead investigators directly to a living person. But before that happened, one final obstacle remained. The killer had spent decades hiding in plain sight. He had lived through the investigation. He had watched California change. He had watched technology evolve. And he had somehow avoided being identified. The question now was no longer whether the evidence existed. It did. The question was whether investigators could find the path from that evidence to the man who had been hiding behind it. For decades, nobody knew that the answer was already beginning to take shape inside a technology that had barely existed when the first attack occurred. The killer had left his biological signature behind. He had unknowingly preserved the key to his own identity. And somewhere ahead, that key was about to be turned. By the beginning of the 21st century, the investigation had reached a strange and frustrating position. Detectives knew far more about the offender than they had known in the 1970s, yet they still could not put a name to him. They knew the crimes were connected. They knew the same biological profile appeared across multiple crime scenes. They knew the offender had operated in Northern and Southern California. They knew the man had committed a long series of sexual assaults, burglaries, and murder. But the one piece of information that could turn all of that evidence into an arrest was still missing: his identity. For years, the case had seemed frozen at that point, trapped between certainty and mystery. The biological evidence could tell investigators that they were dealing with the same man, but it could not tell them where he lived, what he did for a living, or what name appeared on his driver's license. The DNA was powerful, but it was anonymous, and that anonymity allowed the offender to remain outside the reach of investigators long after the crimes themselves had ended. The FBI later described the criminal series as involving approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries between 1976 and 1986. The scale was enormous, yet the man responsible remained unidentified. Then came one of the most important developments in the history of the investigation. Investigators finally proved that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The connection was established through DNA, transforming what had previously appeared to be separate criminal histories into one statewide investigation. Suddenly, the timeline became clear. The attacks in Sacramento were not simply the work of one unknown offender, while the murders in Southern California belonged to another. They were chapters in the criminal history of the same man. The discovery was enormous, but it created an even more frustrating reality. Investigators now had a much clearer picture of the offender's crimes, yet they still did not know who he was. It was like discovering that two fingerprints belonged to the same hand without knowing whose hand it was. The evidence could connect the crimes. It could eliminate suspects. It could establish that investigators were dealing with one offender, but the name remained hidden, and the years continued to pass. The world around the investigation changed dramatically. The technology available to detectives in the early 2000s was vastly different from what investigators had possessed in the 1970s. DNA databases were expanded. Computerized records were becoming standard. Forensic laboratories had capabilities that earlier detectives could scarcely have imagined. Yet even with those advances, the Golden State Killer remained outside the system. His DNA profile did not produce a direct hit. There was no obvious database match that simply revealed the suspect. The killer had apparently never provided investigators with the straightforward connection they needed. The case therefore entered another period of waiting. But waiting did not mean abandonment. Investigators continued to preserve the evidence and revisit the case. The FBI eventually appealed to the public for information, emphasizing that someone who knew the offender might recognize him even if that person had never suspected him of being capable of the crimes. That possibility was crucial. The man investigators were seeking did not necessarily resemble the image of a lifelong criminal. He could have appeared ordinary. He could have worked a conventional job. He could have lived in a neighborhood where nobody suspected him. He could have built relationships while concealing the most violent part of his life. The FBI specifically noted that people who knew the offender might not believe him capable of such crimes, and that he might not have shown obvious violent tendencies or possessed a significant criminal history. That made the case even more difficult. Police could not simply search for the most suspicious person in a community. The offender might have been someone who looked completely unremarkable, and that possibility would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. While detectives continued searching, Forensic science was changing again. DNA profiling had already revolutionized criminal investigations, but a new idea was beginning to emerge. What if investigators did not need to find the offender's DNA directly in a criminal database? What if they could find his relatives instead? Traditional forensic DNA comparison generally works by looking for a match between a crime scene sample and a known reference sample. If the offender has never been arrested, never submitted DNA to a relevant database, and has no direct profile available, the search can stop there. But genetic genealogy introduced a different possibility. A person's DNA contains information about biological relationships. Even when an unknown offender's own profile is absent from a database, a relative might appear. A distant cousin, a second cousin, another branch of the same family. One genetic relationship could lead to another. A family tree could begin to emerge, and somewhere within that tree could be a person who matched the known facts of the investigation. The concept was revolutionary because it changed the question investigators were asked. Instead of asking, who matches this DNA? They could begin asking, which families are connected to this DNA? The difference was enormous. The first question might produce nothing. The second could produce a map. But a map is not a conviction. Investigators still had to be careful. A genetic relationship does not automatically identify a suspect. It creates a lead that must be tested against independent evidence. The process requires genealogical research, historical records, geographic information, age calculations, family structures, and traditional investigative work. The Golden State Killer case would eventually demonstrate exactly how powerful that combination could become. But before investigators could use it, they had to find a way to apply the method to a decades-old forensic profile. That challenge was formidable. The crimes had occurred long before consumer genealogy services became widespread. The suspect's biological relatives might have no idea that their DNA could one day become relevant to a criminal investigation. Yet genetic genealogy databases were beginning to contain information from people interested in ancestry and family history. The technology was creating a new kind of investigative landscape. Family connections that had once existed only in private genealogical records could now become clues in unsolved crimes. And the Golden State Killer investigation was about to enter that new world. For decades, the offender had benefited from the limitations of forensic science. He had committed his crimes before DNA profiling became a mature investigative technology. He had survived the transition from paper records to computerized databases. He had watched decades pass without his identity being exposed. But the same passage of time had produced something he could not control. Technological progress. Science was developing methods that could examine the old evidence in ways the original investigators had never imagined. The biological samples had been collected decades earlier. The information inside them had not changed. What changed was the ability to interpret it. That distinction would become the heart of the breakthrough. The clue was not new. The language used to understand it was new. The DNA had been waiting, and now investigators were learning how to ask it a different question. The case reached a critical point in 2017 and early 2018 when investigators began pursuing investigative genetic genealogy. The approach was not simply a matter of entering DNA into a website and receiving a name. It required careful analysis and genealogical reconstruction. Investigators were effectively trying to walk backward through generations, following genetic relationships until they could narrow the possibility. Somewhere in those branches was the family of the unknown offender. Somewhere was a connection that could point toward him. The task was painstaking. Every family tree could contain dozens or hundreds of people. Many would be impossible suspects because of age, sex, geography, or other known facts. Others could be eliminated through traditional investigative methods. The goal was not to identify every relative. The goal was to find the one person who fit the entire picture. And eventually, investigators arrived at a name that would have seemed almost impossible to connect with the case: Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo was a former police officer. He was 72 years old. He had lived for decades in California. The discovery immediately created a disturbing contradiction. The man investigators were now examining was not some vanished fugitive living under a false identity in another country. He was an older California resident who had apparently remained within ordinary society. The possibility that the Golden State Killer had spent decades living an apparently normal life was deeply unsettling. But investigators could not rely on appearances. They needed proof. The genealogical trail had created a suspect. Traditional forensic testing would have to determine whether that suspect was actually the man whose DNA had been recovered from the crimes. This was the moment when 40 years of investigation narrowed to one biological question. Did Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA match the DNA profile preserved from the crime scene? The answer would change everything. Investigators obtained biological evidence associated with DeAngelo and compared it with the forensic profile connected to the Golden State Killer. The result provided the confirmation they needed. The anonymous DNA finally had a name. The unknown offender was no longer only a biological profile. He was Joseph James DeAngelo. The investigation that had begun in 1976 was suddenly moving toward an arrest. The FBI's historical timeline records April 24th. SIL 2018 as the date DeAngelo was arrested by Sacramento law enforcement after investigators used DNA investigative genealogy to narrow the suspect pool and identify him. The moment was extraordinary because it represented the collapse of 40 years of anonymity in a matter of days. The killer had spent decades beyond the reach of conventional investigation, but once the genetic genealogy pathway was opened, the distance between an unknown DNA profile and a real person began shrinking rapidly. The man who had once seemed almost invisible now had an address. He had a history. He had a name. And he was within reach of investigators. For the survivors, the announcement was something many had waited decades to hear. The unknown offender had finally been identified. But the arrest also created a new set of questions. How had he managed to remain unidentified for so long? What had his life looked like after the crimes ended? Had anyone around him ever suspected him? And how could a man connected to such a massive criminal history have remained hidden in ordinary society for more than 40 years? Those questions would become almost as compelling as the original mystery, because the most disturbing possibility was now becoming reality. The Golden State Killer had not vanished. He had been living somewhere in California while the investigation continued without his name. The killer had hidden in plain sight, not by disappearing completely, but by allowing time to bury the connection between his present life and his past crimes. Yet time had failed him in the end. The evidence had survived. The science had advanced. The genealogy had opened the door, and the DNA had finished the job. After 40 years, the anonymous biological signature finally pointed to one human being, Joseph James DeAngelo. The cold case was no longer a question of who the killer might be. It was now a question of what would happen when the man investigators had searched for across generations finally stood before the law. By the beginning of the 21st century, the investigation had reached a strange and frustrating position. Detectives knew far more about the offender than they had known in the 1970s, yet they still could not put a name to him. They knew the crimes were connected. They knew the same biological profile appeared across multiple crime scenes. They knew the offender had operated in Northern and Southern California. They knew the man had committed a long series of sexual assaults, burglaries, and murder. But the one piece of information that could turn all of that evidence into an arrest was still missing: his identity. For years, the case had seemed frozen at that point, trapped between certainty and mystery. The biological evidence could tell investigators that they were dealing with the same man, but it could not tell them where he lived, what he did for a living, or what name appeared on his driver's license. The DNA was powerful, but it was anonymous, and that anonymity allowed the offender to remain outside the reach of investigators long after the crimes themselves had ended. The FBI later described the criminal series as involving approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries between 1976 and 1986. The scale was enormous, yet the man responsible remained unidentified. Then came one of the most important developments in the history of the investigation. Investigators finally proved that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The connection was established through DNA, transforming what had previously appeared to be separate criminal histories into one statewide investigation. Suddenly, the timeline became clearer. The attacks in Sacramento were not simply the work of one unknown offender, while the murders in Southern California belonged to another. They were chapters in the criminal history of the same man. The discovery was enormous, but it created an even more frustrating reality. Investigators now had a much clearer picture of the offender's crimes, yet they still did not know who he was. It was like discovering that two fingerprints belonged to the same hand without knowing whose hand it was. The evidence could connect the crimes. It could eliminate suspects. It could establish that investigators were dealing with one offender, but the name remained hidden, and the years continued to pass. The world around the investigation changed dramatically. The technology available to detectives in the early 2000s was vastly different from what investigators had possessed in the 1970s. DNA databases were expanded. Computerized records were becoming standard. Forensic laboratories had capabilities that earlier detectives could scarcely have imagined. Yet even with those advances, the Golden State Killer remained outside the system. His DNA profile did not produce a direct hit. There was no obvious database match that simply revealed the suspect. The killer had apparently never provided investigators with the straightforward connection they needed. The case, therefore, entered another period of waiting. But waiting did not mean abandonment. Investigators continued to preserve the evidence and revisit the case. The FBI eventually appealed to the public for information, emphasizing that someone who knew the offender might recognize him even if that person had never suspected him of being capable of the crimes. That possibility was crucial. The man investigators were seeking did not necessarily resemble the image of a lifelong criminal. He could have appeared ordinary. He could have worked a conventional job. He could have lived in a neighborhood where nobody suspected him. He could have built relationships while concealing the most violent part of his life. The FBI specifically noted that people who knew the offender might not believe him capable of such crimes, and that he might not have shown obvious violent tendencies or possessed a significant criminal history. That made the case even more difficult. Police could not simply search for the most suspicious person in a community. The offender might have been someone who looked completely unremarkable, and that possibility would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. While detectives continued searching, forensic science was changing again. DNA profiling had already revolutionized criminal investigations, but a new idea was beginning to emerge. What if investigators did not need to find the offender's DNA directly in a criminal database? What if they could find his relatives instead? Traditional forensic DNA comparison generally works by looking for a match between a crime scene sample and a known reference sample. If the offender has never been arrested, never submitted DNA to a relevant database, and has no direct profile available, the search can stop there. But genetic genealogy introduced a different possibility. A person's DNA contains information about biological relationships. Even when an unknown offender's own profile is absent from a database, a relative might appear. A distant cousin, a second cousin, another branch of the same family. One genetic relationship could lead to another. A family tree could begin to emerge, and somewhere within that tree could be a person who matched the known facts of the investigation. The concept was revolutionary because it changed the question investigators were asked. Instead of asking, who matches this DNA? They could begin asking, which families are connected to this DNA? The difference was enormous. The first question might produce nothing. The second could produce a map. But a map is not a conviction. Investigators still had to be careful. A genetic relationship does not automatically identify a suspect. It creates a lead that must be tested against independent evidence. The process requires genealogical research, historical records, geographic information, age calculations, family structures, and traditional investigative work. The Golden State Killer case would eventually demonstrate exactly how powerful that combination could become. But before investigators could use it, they had to find a way to apply the method to a decades-old forensic profile. That challenge was formidable. The crimes had occurred long before consumer genealogy services became widespread. The suspect's biological relatives might have no idea that their DNA could one day become relevant to a criminal investigation. Yet genetic genealogy databases were beginning to contain information from people interested in ancestry and family history. The technology was creating a new kind of investigative landscape. Family connections that had once existed only in private genealogical records now become clues in unsolved crimes. And the Golden State Killer investigation was about to enter that new world. For decades, the offender had benefited from the limitations of forensic science. He had committed his crimes before DNA profiling became a mature investigative technology. He had survived the transition from paper records to computerized databases. He had watched decades pass without his identity being exposed. But the same passage of time had produced something he could not control: technological progress. Science was developing methods that could examine the old evidence in ways the original investigators had never imagined. The biological samples had been collected decades earlier. The information inside them had not changed. What changed was the ability to interpret it. That distinction would become the heart of the breakthrough. The clue was not new. The language used to understand it was new. The DNA had been waiting, and now investigators were learning how to ask it a different question. The case reached a critical point in 2017 and early 2018 when investigators began pursuing investigative genetic genealogy. The approach was not simply a matter of entering DNA into a website and receiving a name. It required careful analysis and genealogical reconstruction. Investigators were effectively trying to walk backward through generations, following genetic relationships until they could narrow the possibility. Somewhere in those branches was the family of the unknown offender. Somewhere was a connection that could point toward him. The task was painstaking. Every family tree could contain dozens or hundreds of people. Many would be impossible suspects because of age, sex, geography, or other known facts. Others could be eliminated through traditional investigative methods. The goal was not to identify every relative. The goal was to find the one person who fit the entire picture. And eventually, investigators arrived at a name that would have seemed almost impossible to connect with the case: Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo was a former police officer. He was 72 years old. He had lived for decades in California. The discovery immediately created a disturbing contradiction. The man investigators were now examining was not some vanished fugitive living under a false identity in another country. He was an older California resident who had apparently remained within ordinary society. The possibility that the Golden State Killer had spent decades living an apparently normal life was deeply unsettling. But investigators could not rely on appearances. They needed proof. The genealogical trail had created a suspect. Traditional forensic testing would have to determine whether that suspect was actually the man whose DNA had been recovered from the crimes. This was the moment when 40 years of investigation narrowed to one biological question: did Joseph James D'Angelo's DNA match the DNA profile preserved from the crime scene? The answer would change everything. Investigators obtained biological evidence associated with D'Angelo and compared it with the forensic profile connected to the Golden State Killer. The result provided the confirmation they needed. The anonymous DNA finally had a name. The unknown offender was no longer only a biological profile. He was Joseph James D'Angelo. The investigation that had begun in 1976 was suddenly moving toward an arrest. The FBI's historical timeline records April 24th, SIL 2018, as the date D'Angelo was arrested by Sacramento law enforcement after investigators used DNA investigative genealogy to narrow the suspect pool and identify him. The moment was extraordinary because it represented the collapse of 40 years of anonymity in a matter of days. The killer had spent decades beyond the reach of conventional investigation, but once the genetic genealogy pathway was opened, the distance between an unknown DNA profile and a real person began shrinking rapidly. The man who had once seemed almost invisible now had an address. He had a history. He had a name. And he was within reach of investigators. For the survivors, the announcement was something many had waited decades to hear. The unknown offender had finally been identified. But the arrest also created a new set of questions. How had he managed to remain unidentified for so long? What had his life looked like after the crimes ended? Had anyone around him ever suspected him? And how could a man connected to such a massive criminal history have remained hidden in ordinary society for more than 40 years? Those questions would become almost as compelling as the original mystery, because the most disturbing possibility was now becoming reality. The Golden State Killer had not vanished. He had been living somewhere in California while the investigation continued without his name. The killer had hidden in plain sight, not by disappearing completely, but by allowing time to bury the connection between his present life and his past crimes. Yet time had failed him in the end. The evidence had survived. The science had advanced. The genealogy had opened the door. And the DNA had finished the job. After 40 years, the anonymous biological signature finally pointed to one human being, Joseph James D'Angelo. The cold case was no longer a question of who the killer might be. It was now a question of what would happen when the man investigators had searched for across generations finally stood before the law. The name Joseph James D'Angelo had finally emerged from the darkness, but a name alone was not enough. For 40 years, investigators had lived with uncertainty. They had watched leads disappear. They had tested possibilities. They had followed descriptions that could fit dozens of men. They had preserved evidence that could connect the crimes, but could not identify the offender. Now, suddenly, they had a 72-year-old former police officer in their sights, and the entire investigation had narrowed to one question. Could the DNA prove that this ordinary-looking California resident was the man whose crimes had terrorized the state for more than a decade? The answer had to be absolute. There could be no assumption, no shortcut, no arrest based only on a family tree. Investigators needed the biological evidence to speak for itself. The FBI later confirmed that D'Angelo was arrested on April 24th, SIL 2018, after investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to narrow the pool of suspects and ultimately identify him. But behind that single date was a remarkable investigative process. The DNA profile had existed for years. In fact, by 2016, investigators were already publicly acknowledging that they had DNA from multiple crime scenes that could be used to link or eliminate suspects. The FBI's national campaign described the unknown offender as responsible for approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and more than 120 residential burglaries between 1976 and 1986. Investigators could compare a suspect's DNA against the profile and quickly eliminate innocent people. But elimination was not identification. Again and again, the same wall appeared. The killer's DNA existed, but the killer's name did not. That was why the development of investigative genetic genealogy mattered so much. It created a path around the wall. Instead of waiting for the killer to appear in a conventional law enforcement database, investigators could examine genetic relationships and search for relatives. The FBI now describes forensic genetic genealogy as a process involving non-law enforcement DNA databases and the identification of genetic relatives, which can then help investigators locate an offender within a family tree. In the Golden State Killer investigation, that approach changed the case from a search for an invisible man into a search through a biological family network. The difference was enormous. A direct DNA search had produced no name. A family tree could produce possibilities, and possibilities could be tested. Investigators were no longer staring into an empty database. They were following branches. Every branch contained people. Every person could be evaluated. Age could eliminate some. Geography could eliminate others. Known history could eliminate more. Eventually, one individual could emerge as the strongest candidate. That candidate was D'Angelo. But even then, investigators had to be cautious. A genealogical connection could point toward the right family without automatically proving which family member had committed the crimes. Traditional police work remained essential. The biological evidence recovered from the original crimes had to be compared against D'Angelo's DNA. That confirmation became the decisive moment. The man who had spent decades as an anonymous profile now had a biological identity that investigators could place against the evidence. The mystery had crossed a line. It was no longer an unsolved question of who might have committed the crimes. It was an investigation centered on a specific person. And then came the arrest. On April 24th, SIL 2018, Sacramento law enforcement arrested D'Angelo. The news traveled rapidly. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been one of America's most notorious unidentified offenders. Suddenly, the face behind the aliases had been revealed. The arrest was extraordinary not only because of the age of the case, but because of the suspect himself. D'Angelo was 72. He was not a young fugitive fleeing across borders. He was an older California resident who had apparently spent decades living an ordinary life after the crimes ended. That reality made the case even more disturbing. The killer had not needed to disappear from society. He had only needed to remain invisible to the investigation. For survivors, the announcement carried a different kind of shock. They had lived with memories that had no confirmed identity attached to them. For decades, the person who had invaded their homes, threatened them, assaulted them, or destroyed their families existed as a faceless figure. Now that figure had a name. The investigation had finally crossed the distance between memory and identity. But the arrest also raised a question that seemed almost impossible. How had this man remained undetected for so long? The answer was partly historical. He had committed the earliest known crimes before modern forensic DNA profiling was available. The evidence existed, but the technology required to interpret it did not. The FBI has emphasized that forensic genetic genealogy is distinct from conventional familial searching and that its use involves different genetic markers and non-law enforcement databases. That distinction matters because the Golden State Killer case was not solved by a simple computer alert. It was solved through a combination of forensic science, genealogy, historical research, and traditional police investigation. The technology opened the door. Investigators still had to walk through it. Once D'Angelo became the focus, authorities could begin examining the rest of his history. He had previously worked as a police officer in California. That fact immediately became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The man who had been hunted for decades had himself been connected to law enforcement. Yet that did not mean that his identity had been obvious. The FBI had warned publicly in 2016 that the offender might have had military or law enforcement interests or training, but also cautioned that people who knew him might not believe him capable of the crimes and that he might not have displayed obvious violent tendencies or a significant criminal history. The warning now carried a chilling resonance. The offender had apparently been hiding not in some remote location, but within the ordinary world investigators had been searching. That was the meaning of the phrase "hid in plain sight." He had not become invisible because nobody could see him. He became invisible because nobody connected the man they saw with the crimes committed decades earlier. The passage of time had created separation between the suspect's present identity and his criminal past. The young man described by witnesses in the 1970s had become an elderly man in 2018. Physical appearances change. Hair disappears or turns gray. Faces age. Bodies change. Memories become less precise. But DNA does not undergo that kind of transformation. The biological signature remained capable of connecting the old crimes to the present suspect. The evidence had effectively frozen the offender in time. The crimes belonged to the past, but the DNA could reach into the present. And that is why the arrest felt almost surreal. Investigators had spent decades searching for someone who had become old while they were searching. The killer had aged, but the evidence had not forgotten him. The arrest also demonstrated the importance of preserving cold case evidence. The FBI's own archive emphasizes that fingerprints, shoe impressions, and DNA remained among the evidence collected in the case, and that modern DNA technology could be used both to exclude suspects and verify the killer's identity. That principle became central to the entire investigation. Evidence does not become meaningless simply because it is old. Sometimes the opposite is true. Old evidence can become more valuable when science advances. A biological sample that could not identify anyone in 1976 could become decisive decades later. The same piece of evidence could move from almost useless to extraordinarily powerful without changing at all. Only the technology around it changed. That is precisely what happened here. The case was not solved because investigators suddenly discovered a forgotten confession or found a secret photograph hidden in an attic. The breakthrough came because investigators found a new way to interpret evidence that had been sitting in the case for years. That distinction transformed the Golden State Killer investigation into a landmark cold case. The breakthrough also changed the public understanding of forensic genealogy. Before the case, many people associated genealogy with family trees, ancestry, and questions about where their grandparents or great-grandparents came from. After the arrest, people began to understand that genetic relationships could potentially become investigative clues. A distant relative could unknowingly help investigators identify an unknown offender. A family tree could become a map leading toward a suspect, and that raised difficult questions about privacy and consent. If one person voluntarily uploads genetic information for ancestry purposes, what happens when those genetic relationships help investigators identify another person? How should law enforcement use these databases? What safeguards should exist? What kinds of crimes justify such searches? The Golden State Killer case became central to those debates precisely because the result was so dramatic. A 40-year mystery had been broken open. The technique had demonstrated extraordinary power, but extraordinary power always demands careful boundaries. For investigators, however, the immediate priority was the prosecution. The arrest did not erase the crimes. It did not automatically resolve every legal question. It began a new chapter in which decades of evidence would have to be assembled into a criminal case. Prosecutors would have to present the evidence. Survivors and families would have to confront the man who had remained a shadow for most of their adult lives. And D'Angelo would have to face the consequences of crimes that had once seemed almost impossible to connect to a living suspect. The public had been waiting for an arrest. But an arrest was not the same thing as justice. The investigation had finally found the man. The next question was whether the legal system could prove responsibility and provide accountability. The case that began with an unidentified intruder in Sacramento in 1976 had now reached a courtroom more than 4 decades later. The evidence had crossed generations. The suspect had grown old. The investigators had changed. The technology had transformed. But the central facts of the crimes remained. And for the first time, the person at the center of the investigation was no longer an invisible figure moving through the darkness. He was sitting in custody, identified by the very biological evidence he had unknowingly left behind. The 40-year pursuit had ended with a DNA profile pointing to a name, but the final reckoning had only begun. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo did not immediately bring the Golden State Killer story to an end. It opened a new and deeply personal chapter because after more than 40 years of unanswered questions, the investigation was no longer centered on an invisible offender somewhere in California. It was centered on a living man sitting in custody, a man whose identity investigators had finally connected to the DNA profile preserved from the crime. For the first time, survivors and families could look at the person accused of crimes that had haunted them for most of their lives and know that the search was no longer hypothetical. The unknown man had become Joseph James D'Angelo, and the name that had remained hidden for decades was now attached to one of the most notorious criminal investigations in California history. The shock was intensified by the passage of time. D'Angelo was 72 when he was arrested. The crimes had begun in 1976, when he was in his 30s. For decades had transformed the world around him. Neighborhoods had changed. Technology had changed. Investigators had retired. Witnesses had grown older. Some had died. Survivors had spent entire adult lives carrying memories that had never been connected to a known offender. Yet the biological evidence remained capable of bridging that enormous distance. The DNA profile did not care that 40 years had passed. It did not care that the suspect had aged. It simply provided the connection investigators needed. The arrest, therefore, represented more than the capture of an elderly suspect. It represented the collapse of a wall that had stood between evidence and identity for generations. For investigators, the next challenge was to reconstruct the case in a way that could withstand the demands of court. The crimes had occurred across different jurisdictions and over many years. The offender had been known by different names. The East Area Rapist investigation had begun in Northern California. The original Night Stalker investigation had developed in Southern California. Only later had DNA established that the two were the same person. The FBI described the broader series as involving approximately 45 sexual assaults, 12 homicides, and more than 120 residential burglaries between 1976 and 1986. That enormous timeline meant prosecutors were dealing with a case built over decades, not months. Every piece of evidence had a history. Every surviving witness had a story. Every biological sample had to be connected carefully to the crimes from which it came. The prosecution also had to account for the limitations of memory. A witness describing an offender in 2018 might be recalling an encounter from the 1970s. The suspect himself had aged dramatically. The face of a man in his 70s could look nothing like the face described by witnesses decades earlier, but DNA provided something human memory could not: continuity. A witness could forget details. A photograph could become outdated. A physical description could lose accuracy. DNA could still establish a biological relationship between the suspect and evidence collected long before. That was one reason the case became such a landmark in forensic investigation. The science had not replaced traditional detective work. It had strengthened it. Genetic genealogy had narrowed the search. Traditional investigators had identified a candidate. Forensic testing had provided confirmation. Prosecutors could then build a case around evidence that had survived for decades. The arrest also forced the public to reconsider what a cold case really means. For years, the Golden State Killer investigation had appeared almost frozen. The offender had not been identified. The crimes were old. There seemed to be no obvious path forward. But the evidence was never truly gone. It was waiting for technology to catch up. That lesson became especially important for other unsolved cases. A case can appear dormant while the evidence remains active beneath the surface. New technology can change the value of old evidence. A biological sample collected decades ago can suddenly become the most important piece of evidence in the room. The Golden State Killer demonstrated that principle with extraordinary force, but the scientific breakthrough did not erase the human consequences of the crime. Survivors had lived through decades of uncertainty. Some had wondered whether the offender was still alive. Some had feared that he might return. Others had simply tried to move forward without ever knowing whether the person responsible would be identified. The arrest forced those memories back into the present. A mystery that had been part of their past suddenly became current news again. Television cameras appeared. Headlines spread across the country. The name Golden State Killer dominated the media. The public celebrated the breakthrough, but for survivors, the emotional reaction was far more complicated. The man who had once been a faceless intruder now had a face and a name. The knowledge could bring relief, but it could also reopen wounds that had never completely disappeared. There was another unsettling element. D'Angelo had once worked in law enforcement. That fact made the identification particularly disturbing because law enforcement was the very institution that had spent decades searching for the offender. The FBI had previously suggested that the offender might have had law enforcement or military interests or training, and might have understood police tactics. Now investigators were confronting the possibility that their long-running search had ultimately led to a former police officer. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who had once been associated with enforcing the law was now facing prosecution for a series of crimes that had challenged law enforcement for decades. Yet investigators still had to remain focused on evidence rather than symbolism. The DNA connection was central. The genealogy had produced the lead. The biological comparison had provided the confirmation. The rest of the case required careful legal preparation. The arrest itself had been dramatic, but prosecutors knew that a successful prosecution required more than a dramatic arrest. They needed admissible evidence. They needed to establish the connection between D'Angelo and the crime. They needed to present the history clearly enough for a court to understand what had happened over more than a decade, and they needed to give victims and families a chance to participate in the legal process. The case was now moving from investigation to accountability. In the weeks and months following the arrest, authorities continued examining evidence and preparing charges. The enormity of the case became clear. The man who had once been known through aliases was now facing allegations connected to crimes committed across California. The public had spent years imagining the Golden State Killer as an almost mythical figure, a shadow who had disappeared into history. The reality was far more ordinary and therefore more disturbing. He had grown old. He had lived among other people. He had apparently maintained a life after the crimes ended. The absence of an arrest had allowed the mystery to become larger than the individual. Once the individual was identified, that mythology began to collapse. He was not an apparition. He was a human being who could be investigated, charged, prosecuted, and ultimately sentenced. That transformation mattered. For decades, the Golden State Killer had seemed almost untouchable because nobody knew who he was. Identification changed the balance of power. The investigation no longer had to chase a shadow. It could follow a person. Records could be examined. His history could be reconstructed. His movements could be studied. Evidence could be compared. The 40-year-old question had become a concrete criminal prosecution. But there was another reason the arrest mattered. It gave investigators an opportunity to close the gap between separate chapters of California's criminal history. The East Area rapist and original Night Stalker had once been treated as different mysteries. DNA had already established their connection. D'Angelo's arrest provided the human identity behind that connection. The result was a unified narrative that stretched from Sacramento in the 1970s to Southern California murders, and finally to a 2018 arrest. A case that once seemed fragmented now had a central figure, and as prosecutors examined the evidence, the magnitude of the crimes became increasingly difficult to comprehend. For more than 40 years, the victims had carried the consequences while the offender remained unidentified. Now, the legal system had the opportunity to acknowledge those crimes formally. The process would eventually culminate in a guilty plea and a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, but before that happened, the case would enter a courtroom and the survivors would have the opportunity to speak. Their voices would become one of the most powerful elements of the final chapter. The Golden State Killer had spent decades controlling the narrative through anonymity. He had been the unseen figure in police sketches, the name whispered by frightened neighbors, the unknown offender who seemed capable of disappearing after every crime. But once he was identified, he could no longer control what happened next. The evidence would speak. Prosecutors would speak. Survivors would speak. Families would speak. And eventually, the court would speak. The man who had once seemed beyond reach would have to listen. For the first time in 40 years, the victims would not be the only people carrying the weight of what had happened. The offender would be forced to face it as well. The passage of time had not erased the crimes. It had only delayed the moment of accountability. And the most remarkable part was that the breakthrough had come from evidence created during the very years when investigators had been least capable of using it. The biological trail had survived the decades. Genetic genealogy had provided the direction. DNA had provided the confirmation. Now the justice system had to determine what that evidence would mean in court. The investigation had found its suspect. The mystery had found its name. But the final question remained. After 40 years of silence, would the man at the center of the case finally answer for what had been done? The courtroom phase of the Golden State Killer investigation carried a different kind of tension because the mystery that had dominated California for decades was no longer about finding a hidden man. The hidden man had been found. Now the question was what the justice system would do with the evidence. Joseph James D'Angelo had been arrested in April 2018, and the identification had stunned the public because investigators had reached him through a combination of genetic genealogy, traditional investigation, and DNA confirmation. But an arrest was only the beginning. The prosecution had to transform decades of investigative work into a legal case, and that meant revisiting crimes that had occurred when many of the people involved were young, when forensic technology was primitive compared with modern standards, and when the offender himself had been only one unknown figure among thousands of potential suspects. The passage of time created extraordinary challenges. Memories had aged. Evidence had to be carefully authenticated. Investigators had to reconstruct events that had happened decades earlier. Survivors had to decide whether they were prepared to confront the man they believed had destroyed part of their lives. Families had to prepare themselves for a legal process that would reopen wounds they had carried for generations. The case had begun as an investigation into an unknown predator. It had now become a confrontation between the past and the present. The evidence was old, but the consequences were still alive. As prosecutors assembled the case, the central biological evidence remained critical. DNA had first helped investigators understand that crimes committed in different parts of California were connected. It had later helped create the genetic profile that investigators used for genealogical research. And finally, DNA had confirmed the connection to D'Angelo. The FBI has described genetic genealogy as a technique that can identify genetic relatives of an unknown offender and help investigators build a family tree leading toward a suspect. The Golden State Killer case became one of the most famous demonstrations of that method, but the science was only one part of the legal story. A prosecution also had to establish the human consequences of the crimes. Behind every laboratory report was a person. Behind every DNA sample was a crime scene. Behind every count was a victim. The sheer number of crimes connected to the investigation made the case difficult to comprehend. The FBI later described approximately 45 sexual assaults, 12 homicides, and more than 120 residential burglaries connected to the offender between 1976 and 1986. Yet the criminal charges brought against D'Angelo represented only a portion of that enormous history. The legal system had to work within the charges that could be proven and prosecuted. That did not mean the other crimes disappeared. They remained part of the broader historical record and part of the devastating legacy left by the offender. The legal proceedings therefore became a process of narrowing an enormous criminal history into specific counts that could be resolved in court. For survivors, however, the distinction between charged and uncharged crimes could never fully describe what had happened to them. Their experiences were not numbers in a case file. They were memories carried for decades. Some had been forced to rebuild their lives around events they could not erase. Others had spent years wondering whether the person responsible would ever be found. Some had lived with the knowledge that the offender remained unidentified while they tried to move forward. The arrest changed that equation. Suddenly, the uncertainty had a face. The person who had once been a faceless intruder was now standing before the justice system. The legal process eventually led to a dramatic decision. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The guilty plea was a defining moment because it eliminated the need for a lengthy trial on those charges while formally establishing his guilt in court. For many observers, the plea was the moment when the 40-year mystery finally transformed into legal accountability. But the emotional weight of the proceedings was only beginning to emerge. The sentencing phase would allow survivors and relatives to confront D'Angelo directly. The man who had once controlled victims through fear would now sit in a courtroom while they described the consequences of his action. That reversal was significant. During the crimes, victims had been forced into silence. Decades later, they were given a platform. The offender no longer controlled the story. The survivors did. Their words became part of the historical record. Their memories could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents attributed to an unknown man. They were evidence of lives permanently changed. The sentencing proceedings also revealed how the passage of time had affected the victims. 40 years does not simply create distance. It creates an entire lifetime between an event and its resolution. A person assaulted in the 1970s could become a parent, grandparent, or retiree before ever learning who was responsible. A family that lost a loved one could spend decades without a definitive answer. The eventual identification, therefore, carried an unusual emotional contradiction. It arrived incredibly late, but it still mattered. Justice delayed had not become meaningless. The truth still had power. The courtroom became the place where that truth could finally be spoken without the offender remaining a faceless mystery. D'Angelo's guilty plea also removed one of the major uncertainties that had surrounded the case. The public no longer had to rely solely on the DNA evidence and investigative conclusion. The defendant himself admitted guilt to the charged offenses. The decades of investigation had reached a formal legal acknowledgement. Yet the case remained deeply unsettling because of what had happened before the arrest. How could a man connected to such a long criminal history remain unidentified for so many years? Part of the answer lay in the limitations of the era. When the first crimes occurred, DNA profiling was not yet available as a modern identification tool. the FBI did not begin performing DNA analysis for criminal investigations until 1988. The offender therefore operated during a period when forensic science could collect biological evidence without being able to use it in the way investigators eventually would. That historical accident became one of the most important reasons the case remained unsolved for so long. But technology alone does not explain 40 years. The offender also benefited from the fragmented nature of the investigation. His crimes occurred across different communities and jurisdictions. He was known by different names. The East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker investigations developed separately before DNA connected them. Once that connection was established, investigators knew they were searching for one offender, but they still lacked a direct identity. This fragmentation allowed the case to remain mysterious even as investigators learned more about the criminal pattern. The eventual use of genetic genealogy attacked that fragmentation from another direction. Instead of looking only at where the crimes occurred, investigators looked at the biological relationships surrounding the DNA profile. The geography became less important than the family tree. The question shifted from where did this offender operate to who is genetically connected to this offender. That was the conceptual breakthrough that allowed the investigation to move beyond the limitations of traditional databases. But the courtroom did not focus on technology alone. The legal process brought attention back to the people whose lives had been changed. The victims had lived through the crimes. They had survived the investigation. They had endured decades without answers. Now they could finally speak directly to the man responsible. The sentencing hearings became a moment of confrontation unlike anything that had occurred during the original investigation. The offender could no longer hide behind a ski mask, darkness, distance, or time. His identity was known. His crimes had been documented. His guilt had been entered into the court record. And the people he had harmed had the opportunity to tell him what his actions had done. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence closed the formal criminal proceeding, but it did not close the emotional history of the case. There is no sentence capable of restoring murdered victims to their families. There is no prison term that can erase decades of fear. There is no court ruling that can return a survivor to the person they were before the crime. The sentence could provide accountability, but not restoration. That distinction became especially important because the Golden State Killer case had been so heavily defined by its mystery. The public had spent decades asking who the offender was. Once the name was known, the natural expectation was that everything would suddenly feel complete, but real life does not work that way. Identification answers one question. It does not undo what happened. For many survivors, the most important change was simply that uncertainty ended. They knew who had been responsible. They knew he had been found. They knew he would spend the rest of his life in prison. They knew that the man who had once seemed capable of escaping justice had finally been held accountable. That certainty could never replace what had been lost, but it mattered. The case also left a powerful message for investigators working other cold cases. Never assume that an old case is truly dead. Evidence can survive. Technology can change. A biological sample preserved for decades may eventually become the key to identifying an offender. A family tree may reveal what a criminal database cannot. A case that appears impossible today may look completely different tomorrow. The Golden State Killer investigation became a demonstration of that principle on a scale few cases had ever achieved. The killer had been unidentified for 40 years, yet the evidence had never stopped pointing toward him. It simply required investigators to discover a new route to the answer. The courtroom therefore represented more than the conclusion of a prosecution. It represented the moment when decades of investigative persistence became accountability. The names of the victims were no longer attached only to unsolved crime. Their cases had been connected to a known offender. The East Area Rapist was no longer an unidentified predator. The original Night Stalker was no longer an unsolved killer. The Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery. The name Joseph James D'Angelo now stood at the center of the case. But even after the sentence, one question remained hauntingly powerful. How had he managed to lie for so many years while the world searched for him? The answer would force investigators, journalists, and the public to examine not only the science that caught him, but also the ordinary life he appeared to have maintained while carrying a secret that had remained hidden for decades. The man had been identified. The court had spoken. The prison sentence was permanent, but the story of how a killer could hide in plain sight for so long was still waiting to be fully understood. By the time Joseph James D'Angelo stood before the court, the mystery that had terrified California for more than 40 years had already been transformed by one extraordinary fact. The man investigators had spent decades searching for had apparently never needed to flee the state, abandon his identity, or disappear into another country. He had simply continued living while the investigation remained unresolved, and that reality made the case more disturbing than the image of a conventional fugitive ever could. The Golden State Killer had been imagined for years as a shadow moving through the darkness, but shadows disappear when the light changes. In 2018, the light was DNA. The arrest exposed a reality that survivors and investigators had spent decades trying to understand. The offender had been hidden not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence had been waiting for science to catch up. The DNA profile had survived. The case files had survived. The memories had survived. And eventually, they converged on one man. The FBI's later account of the investigation described how investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to identify D'Angelo after decades of conventional investigation had failed to produce his name. The technique changed the entire logic of the search. For years, detectives had looked outward, trying to find a suspect who matched descriptions, geography, behavior, and known circumstances. Genetic genealogy allowed them to look backward through biological relationship. The unknown offender's DNA became a starting point rather than an ending point. A genetic profile that could not directly identify a person could still reveal relatives. Relatives could reveal families. Families could reveal branches. Branches could reveal candidates. And candidates could be investigated using traditional method. The process was painstaking, but it created something the investigation had lacked for decades: direction. The suspect was no longer somewhere among an unknowable population. He was somewhere inside a narrowing biological network. Once investigators reached D'Angelo, they still had to prove the connection. That final confirmation was critical because genetic genealogy is an investigative lead, not a substitute for forensic verification. Investigators obtained DNA associated with D'Angelo and compared it with evidence connected to the crime. The match provided the bridge between the genealogical investigation and the criminal case. The man whose name had emerged from the family tree was connected to the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. The case had crossed its most important threshold. The unknown offender was identified, but the arrest created another mystery that had existed beneath the original one. What had the killer's life looked like after the crime stopped? The attacks associated with the Golden State Killer had occurred between 1976 and 1986, according to the FBI's historical description of the case. Then the crime stopped. There was no dramatic public announcement that the offender had retired from criminal activity. No final confession. No clear explanation. The attacks simply ceased. For investigators, that silence created uncertainty. Had the offender died? Had he been imprisoned for another offense? Had he left California? Had he changed his behavior? Had he simply decided to stop? The absence of new crimes meant there were fewer opportunities to collect fresh evidence. Time became the enemy. Every year without an attack made the case older. Every year without an arrest made the identity harder to recover through ordinary investigative method. Yet the same silence that protected the offender also meant that investigators had decades to preserve the evidence. When technology eventually changed, the old evidence was still available. D'Angelo's age at the time of arrest became another striking feature of the case. He was 72. The man described in witness accounts from the 1970s had been young, athletic, and physically capable. The person arrested in 2018 was an elderly man. The transformation illustrated the limitations of eyewitness identification across 4 decades. A witness who remembered a young offender could not simply be expected to recognize an elderly suspect. Time changes faces. DNA does not. That difference helped explain why the biological evidence became so important. It did not depend on the suspect continuing to look the way he had looked 40 years earlier, it connected the person to the evidence at a molecular level. The arrest also raised a question that would resonate far beyond this case. Can a person truly hide in plain sight when the evidence of his past is preserved somewhere? For decades, the answer seemed to be yes. D'Angelo had apparently lived a life that did not attract the kind of attention investigators needed. But the eventual identification demonstrated that ordinary life can become part of an investigation years after the fact. A person can live quietly while an unresolved case remains active beneath the surface. The evidence does not need to be visible every day. It only needs to remain available when the right method arrives. That was exactly what happened here. The Golden State Killer case became a symbol of the power of persistence because the investigators who finally identified D'Angelo were not starting from zero. They were standing on decades of work performed by people who never knew whether they would see the case solved. Detectives had interviewed victims. Officers had documented crime scenes. Scientists had preserved biological evidence. Analysts had linked cases. Investigators had established that the East Area rapist and original Night Stalker were the same offender. Each generation added something to the case. None of those contributions alone solved the mystery. Together, they created the foundation for the breakthrough. That is one of the most important lessons hidden inside the dramatic headline about DNA. The breakthrough was not magic. It was cumulative. Genetic genealogy could only work because biological evidence had been collected and preserved. DNA could only confirm D'Angelo because investigators had a reliable forensic profile from the crime. The genealogy could only produce a meaningful suspect because detectives understood the history of the offender. And the prosecution could only move forward because investigators had spent decades documenting the crime. The final arrest therefore represented the culmination of a chain rather than a single discovery. The public often sees the moment of arrest as the moment a case is solved. But behind that moment are years of work that rarely receive the same attention. In the Golden State Killer case, those years were measured in generations. Some of the investigators who worked the earliest crimes never saw the arrest. Some survivors waited most of their adult lives. The case outlived careers, technologies, and entire eras of policing. Yet the evidence remained. That endurance became one of the most powerful symbols of the investigation. The DNA profile was created from biological evidence connected to crimes committed decades earlier. It survived long enough for genetic genealogy to become possible. That meant the offender's own biology eventually became the mechanism of his identification. He had left behind the evidence that would expose him, even though nobody knew at the time how powerful it would become. This is what makes the phrase "hid in plain sight" so unsettling. D'Angelo did not necessarily need to hide from every person around him. He needed to hide from the connection between his identity and the crimes. The public knew the offender through descriptions, sketches, and aliases. They did not know him as Joseph James D'Angelo. Once that connection was established, the mystery collapsed. The person investigators had searched for was suddenly an identifiable individual with a documented history. The Golden State Killer stopped being a symbol and became a defendant. The transformation was almost instantaneous. For 40 years, people had asked whether the killer was still alive. Now they knew he was. They had asked whether he was still in California. Investigators had found him there. They had wondered whether he had changed his appearance. Time had changed it for him. They had wondered whether science would ever identify him. Science had. The most important question now became what justice would look like after so much time. D'Angelo's guilty plea in June 2020 answered part of that question. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The plea removed the uncertainty of a trial on those charges and formally established his responsibility in court. But for survivors and families, the legal conclusion was only one part of a much larger emotional process. A guilty plea could not erase the memories of the attacks. It could not undo the years of fear. It could not restore the people who had been murdered. What it could do was establish accountability. The person responsible had been identified. He had been brought before the court. He had admitted guilt to the charged offenses, and he would no longer be able to lie freely. The sentencing proceedings then gave victims and families an opportunity to speak. Their voices were perhaps the most important counterpoint to the mythology that had surrounded the Golden State Killer for decades. The media had focused on the aliases, the mystery, the DNA breakthrough, and the extraordinary arrest. Survivors brought the story back to its human center. Their lives had been altered long before the public knew the offender's name. They had lived with fear and uncertainty while the killer remained unknown. Now they could speak directly about the consequences. The courtroom became a place where the offender had to listen to the people he had once terrorized. The dynamic had completely reversed. During the original crimes, the victims had been trapped in a situation controlled by the offender. Decades later, the offender was the one who could not leave. He could not disappear into darkness. He could not change his name. He could not hide behind an alias. He could not outrun DNA. He had been found. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was permanent, but the story was not erased. The case continued to influence law enforcement and forensic science, particularly the use of genetic genealogy in cold case investigation. It also forced a national conversation about genetic privacy. The same technology that could identify a violent offender could also expose family relationships that people never intended to reveal to law enforcement. The power of genetic genealogy therefore came with ethical questions that would continue long after D'Angelo entered prison. Yet the Golden State Killer investigation had already demonstrated its practical potential. A 40-year-old case that once appeared almost impossible had been solved. The offender had been hiding behind time. Time had eventually betrayed him. The science he could not have anticipated had reached backward into the evidence he had left behind. And that may be the most haunting lesson of all. The killer did not lose because he suddenly made a mistake in 2018. He lost because the world changed around evidence he had left decades earlier. The technology advanced. The databases grew, the methods improved. Investigators learned to ask different questions, and eventually the old evidence became capable of producing a new answer. The Golden State Killer had spent decades believing, consciously or unconsciously, that the passage of time separated him from his crime, but the evidence had no sense of time. It remained connected to him. The DNA did not forget. The case file did not forget. The survivors did not forget. And when the right technology arrived, the past came rushing into the present. The killer had hidden in plain sight for decades. Then one DNA clue changed everything, not because the clue was new, but because investigators finally knew how to follow it. The courtroom had become the place where 40 years of silence finally began to break, but the most powerful evidence was no longer hidden inside a laboratory. It was standing before the judge in the voices of survivors and families who had waited decades to speak. For years, the Golden State Killer had existed in the public imagination as a collection of frightening names. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the unknown man who entered homes at night, the predator who seemed to vanish after leaving terror behind. Those names had created an almost mythical figure, but the courtroom stripped away the mythology. There was no longer an anonymous silhouette in a police sketch. There was a defendant. There was a name. There was a fate, and there were people who had spent most of their lives waiting for the opportunity to tell him what his crimes had done. Joseph James D'Angelo had pleaded guilty in June 2020 to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery, accepting responsibility for the charged crimes rather than forcing survivors and families through a lengthy trial. The plea was legally decisive, but emotionally, it was only the beginning of the reckoning. A guilty plea could establish responsibility. It could not restore a murdered husband, wife, daughter, son, mother, or father. It could not erase the fear carried by survivors who had spent decades remembering a stranger standing inside their home. It could not return the years that had been consumed by uncertainty. The crimes had ended decades earlier, but their consequences had never ended. For the victims, the passage of time had not transformed what happened into history. It had simply forced them to carry history inside their own lives. Some had built families. Some had changed careers. Some had grown old. Some had tried never to speak about the attacks again. Yet the unidentified offender remained part of their personal histories, a question without an answer. Who was he? Where was he? Was he still alive? Would he ever be caught? Could he still hurt someone else? For decades, there was no certainty. The arrest in 2018 changed that. Suddenly, the question had an answer. The man responsible had been identified. He was no longer an invisible threat. He was in custody, and by the time the sentencing proceedings began, the victims knew something that had once seemed impossible. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The emotional significance of that certainty cannot be measured simply by the length of a sentence. For survivors, justice was not about pretending that 40 years had somehow disappeared. It was about finally placing responsibility where it belonged. During the attacks, the offender had controlled every element of the situation. He chose the moment. He chose the location. He controlled his victims through threats and violence. He wore disguises. He concealed his identity. He disappeared before police could arrive. Decades later, that balance had been completely reversed. Now he sat in court while other people controlled the narrative. The survivors could speak. Investigators could describe the evidence. Prosecutors could present the history. The judge could impose punishment. D'Angelo could no longer hide behind anonymity. He could no longer force the world to refer to him only by an alias. His real name was known. His criminal history had been exposed. His DNA had connected him to the evidence. His guilty plea had removed the central legal uncertainty surrounding the charged crimes, and the court could finally impose a sentence. In August 2020, D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional time for other offenses. The sentence was designed to ensure that he would never leave prison. But the hearing was not merely about punishment. It was also about recognition. For decades, the victims had existed in a strange position. Their experiences were real, but the person responsible remained unknown. The investigation could identify patterns, collect evidence, and build theories, but it could not give them the simplest answer: the name of the man who had done this. The guilty plea changed that. The crimes were no longer attributed to an unidentified figure. They were legally connected to D'Angelo. The name that had emerged through genetic genealogy was now part of the official record. The case had moved from suspicion to accountability, and that transformation also changed the meaning of the old evidence. DNA had once been simply biological material collected from crime scenes. Later, it became a forensic profile. Then it became a genealogical clue. Finally, it became part of the evidence connecting a living man to crimes committed decades earlier. The same biological trail had passed through several eras of forensic science. In the 1970s, investigators could collect evidence but lacked modern DNA profiling. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA technology became increasingly useful for criminal investigations. By the 2000s, DNA had connected the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker cases. By the late 2010s, investigative genetic genealogy provided a route toward the offender's identity. The progression was extraordinary. The investigation had not been solved by one technological miracle. It had been transformed repeatedly as science advanced. Every generation of investigators inherited the work of the previous one. The detectives who responded to the first attacks could not know how valuable their evidence would become 40 years later. They could not know that biological material preserved from those crime scenes would eventually help identify the offender. They could not know that a new generation of forensic investigators would use genealogy databases to search through distant genetic relationships. Yet they collected the evidence anyway. They documented the scene. They interviewed victims. They preserved records. They built the foundation for a future breakthrough they would never see. That is why cold cases can be so deceptive. From the outside, an unsolved case can look abandoned, but inside the case file, evidence may be waiting for a technology that does not yet exist. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated this in the most dramatic way possible. The offender had benefited from the limitations of his era. He committed his earliest known crimes before DNA profiling could provide investigators with the modern identification tool they would later rely upon. But he could not predict how forensic science would evolve. He could not know that decades later, investigators would be able to use genetic relationships to navigate an enormous family tree. He could not know that the biological material he left behind would eventually point investigators toward his relatives and then toward him. Time had appeared to protect him. In reality, time was building the technological environment that would eventually expose him. The case also changed the way the public understood genetic genealogy. Before the Golden State Killer arrest, many people thought of genealogy as a private search for ancestors, family origins, and distant relatives. Suddenly, it had become a potential law enforcement tool. The implications were enormous. If an unknown offender's DNA could be connected to distant relatives in a genealogy database, investigators might be able to construct a family tree and identify a suspect who had never personally submitted his DNA to that database. That possibility created extraordinary investigative opportunities, but it also raised difficult questions about privacy, consent, and the boundaries of forensic search. The Golden State Killer case became a landmark partly because it demonstrated both sides of that equation. The method had helped solve one of America's most notorious cold cases. At the same time, its success forced society to confront a new reality. Genetic information can reveal relationships extending far beyond the person who originally provided the sample. One person's decision to explore ancestry can potentially create investigative leads involving biological relatives who never made that decision themselves. Those debates would continue long after D'Angelo's sentencing. But inside the courtroom, the central issue was simpler. The victims wanted acknowledgement. They wanted the man responsible to hear what his actions had done. And they wanted the world to understand that the Golden State Killer was not merely an intriguing cold case mystery. He was responsible for real suffering experienced by real people over decades. The dramatic headlines about DNA and genetic genealogy were only one side of the story. The other side was the human cost. Every crime had begun as a moment in someone's life and then continued long after the offender left. The attack ended. The police investigation ended. The newspaper coverage faded, but the memory remained. That was the reality survivors brought into the courtroom. The passage of 40 years had not erased the crimes. It had given the victims 40 years to live with them. And when they finally spoke, the courtroom became a place where those decades could no longer be ignored. The Golden State Killer had spent his criminal years creating fear through silence and anonymity. He rarely needed to announce himself. His presence was enough. A locked door suddenly seemed inadequate. A dark window became threatening. A strange noise in the night could trigger memories of the offender. Ordinary life became filled with possibilities of danger. That psychological damage was part of the legacy of the crimes, even though it could never be measured in a police report. The offender had entered homes, but he had also entered the minds of the people who survived him. Decades later, his arrest offered something the original investigation could never provide: certainty. Not healing in the simplistic sense, not a magical end to trauma, but certainty. The man had been found. The case had been solved. The legal system had confirmed his guilt. The sentence was permanent. There would be